In the aftermath of the Korean War, the southern half of the Korean peninsula was not a place anyone would have pointed to as a future economic power. The war had left behind a country that was physically devastated and economically hollow. Industrial facilities had been destroyed, infrastructure was barely functional, and much of the population was struggling simply to survive. At the time, South Korea's income per person was comparable to some of the poorest regions in the world. It was a nation heavily dependent on foreign aid, particularly from the United States, and without significant natural resources to fuel rapid industrial growth. There was no obvious advantage, no clear pathway that would lead from this level of destruction to global relevance. What existed instead was a growing sense that survival alone was not enough. By the early 1960s, under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, the country began to move in a direction that was both deliberate and highly controlled. Economic development was no longer left to gradual evolution. It became a national project, designed and directed with specific outcomes in mind. The government took on a central role in shaping the economy, not just by setting policy, but by actively guiding which sectors would grow and how they would grow. Credit was not freely distributed, it was allocated. Imports were not simply reduced, they were strategically managed to protect emerging industries. Exports, however, were aggressively encouraged because they represented a way for a resource-poor country to earn the capital it desperately needed. This approach required discipline and, at times, coercion. Businesses were expected to align with national goals, and those that did were given access to financing and support that would otherwise have been impossible to obtain. Those that did not align found themselves excluded from the system. It was not a free market in the conventional sense. It was a coordinated effort to accelerate development under conditions where time and resources were both limited. What began during this period would later be described as the foundation of South Korea's economic transformation. But at the time, it was an uncertain and high-stakes experiment carried out in a country that could not afford failure. As the years moved into the 1970s, the strategy that had been set in motion began to take on a more defined shape. South Korea was no longer simply trying to rebuild. It was attempting to reposition itself within the global economy. This meant moving beyond basic manufacturing into industries that required greater scale, coordination, and technical capability. The state continued to play a central role, but it did so increasingly through a close relationship with a small number of large business groups that would come to dominate the economy. These groups, later known as chaebols, were not initially the global brands they would become. They were domestic enterprises that grew rapidly under conditions where access to capital, protection from competition, and clear performance expectations were tightly linked. Companies such as Samsung and Hyundai expanded into industries that had previously seemed beyond the reach of a country with South Korea's starting position. Shipbuilding, steel production, and heavy manufacturing required not only financial investment but also long-term planning and coordination between the state and private sector. The risks were substantial. Failure in these industries could have set the country back significantly. Yet the alternative, remaining dependent on low-value production, offered little opportunity for meaningful advancement. During this period, economic growth accelerated at a pace that began to attract international attention. Exports increased steadily, and the structure of the economy started to shift. What had once been a largely agrarian society was becoming increasingly urban and industrial. At the same time, this transformation came with significant social and political costs. Labor conditions were demanding, and political power remained concentrated. The government maintained tight control over many aspects of society, prioritizing stability and growth over political liberalization. For many, the benefits of economic progress were accompanied by constraints that limited individual freedoms. Despite these tensions, the overall trajectory was clear. South Korea was no longer defined solely by its post-war condition. It was becoming an industrial economy with the capacity to compete in sectors that required both scale and precision. The foundations laid in earlier decades were beginning to produce results, and the country was moving closer to a position where it could influence, rather than simply participate in, global trade. Part 3. The progress that had been achieved by the late 20th century was significant, but it was not without vulnerabilities. These became evident during the Asian financial crisis, when financial instability spread rapidly across the region. South Korea's economic model, which had relied heavily on close ties between government, banks, and large corporations, faced intense pressure. High levels of debt and structural weaknesses within the financial system made the country particularly exposed. As confidence declined, capital began to leave, and the risk of a broader economic collapse became real. In response, South Korea sought assistance from the International Monetary Fund, entering into a program that required substantial reforms. These reforms were not merely technical adjustments. They represented a shift in how the economy would be managed. Greater transparency was introduced into corporate and financial practices, and the relationship between the state and large business groups began to change. Some companies were forced to restructure, while others did not survive. The process was difficult, but it also created an opportunity to address weaknesses that had developed during earlier periods of rapid growth. What followed was not a retreat from the global economy, but a deeper integration into it. South Korea placed increasing emphasis on innovation, technology, and education, building on the industrial base that had already been established. Firms like Samsung evolved into leaders in advanced manufacturing and electronics, competing at the highest levels of global industry. The country's workforce became more highly skilled, and its economy more diversified. Over time, South Korea transitioned from a position of catching up to one of leadership in key sectors. Its products, technologies, and cultural exports began to reach audiences far beyond its borders, reinforcing its presence on the global stage. What had once been a nation defined by post-war recovery became one defined by its capacity for adaptation and sustained growth. The transformation of South Korea was not the result of a single decision or moment. It was the outcome of decades of coordinated effort, shaped by policy choices, institutional development, and the willingness to take risks under conditions of uncertainty. It is a story that challenges simple explanations of economic success, because it shows that development can be both constructed and contested, shaped as much by deliberate strategy as by circumstance.